Good morning, beautiful people. Happy Saturday. Well, it'll probably be afternoon by the time you get this, but me and John Lennon, we give you our best. Okay, so final exam. We've already talked about what the format is going to be 25 multiple choice questions covering the six plays Atsumori, Everyman, Twelfth Night, Life is a Dream, Tartuffe, and The Rover. Yes. So there's going to be one question about the history for each period, one question about sort of theatrical forms from each period, one question about the play itself, and one question about the playwright. And these are the multiple choice questions. So, say at the beginning we're talking about Atsumori. We probably want to know about, we talked about how China was a huge cultural influence upon Japan. Think about what was the main sort of delivery system of Chinese culture to Japan. We talked about in particularly, look back in your notes, the year 552. Something was gifted to the Japanese government, and that kicked off a big movement that was part of the Chinese culture growing in Japan. Probably want to know what that is. In addition to No theater, which you want to know about, we also talked about two other different kinds of Japanese theater, Bunraku and Kabuki. So just know a little bit about each one of those forms. And then Atsumori, it's a pretty short play. There's not a whole lot you need to remember about it, but at least know who the characters were. Remember, there's only like three main characters in Atsumori. Know who they are. And then, yeah, about No theater particularly, we talked about Ziami, the guy who sort of invented No theater, and the fact that he had some philosophical ideas about what No theater should be, some spiritual ideas, perhaps we might say. So think about those as well. Then we move to the Renaissance period, sort of the late medieval period. We talked about religious vernacular dramas, religious dramas done in the language of the people. They were called something specific. You probably want to know what that is and why it was called that. We talked about In Everyman. In Everyman, it's sort of the first time that we see a particular type of character. Everyman interacts with a lot of different versions of a particular type of character. You want to know what kind of character that is. Think about the Renaissance, late medieval, early Renaissance staging that we talked about. We had the heaven on one side and hell mouth on the other. You probably want to have some idea of what all of that looked like. And then we go to Elizabethan theater. We talked about it as the Tudor, Elizabethan, Stuart period. As far as history goes, one thing that was really, really important was the transition from Catholicism to Protestantism. That came through the power of Henry VIII. What did Henry VIII do to change England from Catholicism to Protestantism? You want to know that. We talked about there were basically three great playwrights of this period. Shakespeare was in the middle, and then he was sandwiched by two others. You probably want to know who those two others are and a little bit about them. Let's see. We talked a little bit about some cultural phenomena in Twelfth Night, some uses of some characters in Twelfth Night that sort of hinted at a particular thing but never really came out and said it. Probably want to understand what that means. Remember that Shakespeare was also an actor as well as an author. Think about that. What role do we know that Shakespeare played? Not necessarily in Twelfth Night, but in one of the other plays that he wrote. Let's see. Sticking on sort of the religious tip as far as that goes, we talked about how in England Henry VIII managed to switch England over from Catholicism to Protestantism in a particular way. In Spain, it kind of went the other way. In Spain, they went all Catholic and kicked everybody else out or did something else to them. What was that something else? That's in the notes. Probably want to know something about that. We talked about autos sacramentales, the Spanish religious vernacular dramas. Know a little bit about those. And then our play was Calderon's Life is a Dream. We want to know a little bit about that, what it entails, who the characters were, where they were. That's probably something good to know. We get to France. We were talking about the history, how France was very topsy-turvy, just like England, because they tended to be fighting with one another. But we talked about a particular character, sort of out of left field, that aided the French defeat of the English and eventually became very, very revered by the French and burned at the stake by the English. You might want to know who that is. We talked a little bit about French neoclassicism. You want to know what those neoclassical rules are, be able to recognize what are those rules and what are not. And we talked about a few specific French neoclassicist playwrights, some who followed the rules and some who totally broke them. You want to know the difference between those two guys. Tartuffe. We talked about Tartuffe being representative, finally, of not simply the upper classes, but the middle classes as well. However, at the end of Tartuffe, someone comes in to save the day. We discussed it as the Rex Ex Machina. You want to be aware of what that means and who that is. Running back across the pond to England, we talked a little bit about the history of the kings fighting against the parliamentarians, the Cavaliers on the king's side, the Roundheads on the parliamentarian side. Who won that particular war in the short term, and then who won that particular conflict in the long term. You want to know that. Let's see, we talked a little bit about how Restoration theaters, the actual theatrical spaces, had changed a little bit from the Elizabethan period to the Restoration period. Kind of want to know what that is. How were they like the Elizabethan theaters, and how were they different? We talked about how acting changed in the Restoration period. That there was an introduction of a particular type of actor that had not been around before. You want to know what that is and who was the most famous practitioner of that class of actor. And then our play was The Rover. We're going to want to know a little bit about sort of the circumstances of The Rover. One of the questions I asked on the quiz, most people only got it half right. I asked about the setting of The Rover. And remember, the setting is not only the place, it is also when. It is the time and the place. And half of you gave me the place and not the time, and half of you gave me the time and not the place, and 2 or 3 of you gave me both. So we want to know a little bit about that and a little bit about the background of the particular characters. Remember, the Cavaliers were on one side, and sort of the Spanish, Italian were on the other side, the men and the ladies. We want to know a little bit about them. Let's see. I mentioned earlier that we talked about No Theater and Bunraku Theater and Kabuki Theater. You're going to want to know a little bit about all of them. With Kabuki specifically, think about how did it start? What did Kabuki start as? And what in its early years were some of the really major changes that happened and why? We're sort of getting up to the short answer questions at this point. We talked about the use of anachronism in the mystery plays, in the cycle plays that we saw in English late medieval history. Think about that. How is anachronism used? I'm pretty sure I mentioned this on Friday, but one of the things that we talked about with Twelfth Night was the fact that it sort of marked a really, really big change in Shakespeare's plays, in what kind of plays that he was writing. There was sort of before Twelfth Night and after Twelfth Night. So be aware of what that is and think about ways that you can describe how his playwriting shifted from one point to the other. We talked about in one for Life is a Dream, Segismundo, the main character, the prince who was raised in a cave, and at the end of the play, he makes certain decisions that may or may not be good decisions. But good and right are not necessarily always exactly the same thing. So think about those decisions that we talked about in class. Let's see what else. Moliere and Tartuffe. When we talked about Tartuffe, we talked about that there was a great controversy regarding Tartuffe. In fact, it's so great that the play got banned and taken off of the stage, even though it was quite popular. Know a little bit about that, what that controversy was, and what the ending of that controversy was. How did that end? Was Tartuffe never seen again? Probably not, since we're still reading it today. But why, in that case, why are we still reading it today? What happened to get us to this point? And then finally, the final question, the Restoration Theater question, that is going to be the essay question at the end. So these earlier things that I was just referring to were first the short or the multiple choice questions, and then the short answer questions here. The essay question is going to be about our very last play and our very last playwright. So know a little bit about Aphra Behn. We included her specifically for a reason, and we talked pretty heavily about what kind of pioneer Aphra Behn was and what kind of trailblazer, and how that was viewed both in her time and later on, both later on in the quote-unquote short term, say in the next century or two after her lifetime, and then more currently in the past, say the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century, how she's viewed now. So be aware of sort of how her reputation has shifted from when she was actually alive to the first century or two after her death until more contemporary times. That's what you're going to want to be aware of, and for the essay question. Okay, so I can't think that of anything else that you're going to need to know. That's probably enough. But again, so just refamiliarize yourself with those 6 periods: medieval Japan, late medieval Europe, Elizabethan England, the Renaissance Spain, Renaissance France, and Restoration England. Our plays are Atsumori, Everyman, Twelfth Night, Life is a Dream, Tartuffe, and The Rover. Sort of go over those, the synopses in your head again, refamiliarize yourself with the playwrights of those, and you'll probably do all right. If you have any questions about anything, of course, please feel free to email me. I received 2 research papers via email yesterday. Thank you, ladies. If anybody else still owes me theirs, get it to me today because it's now officially late. And other than that, have a lovely, lovely weekend. Don't spend it all studying, but since it's supposed to snow, you probably want to stay inside anyway. And I will see you Monday morning. I look forward to it. Namaste.